Walls of Silence, Love, Labor, and the Struggle for Justice Introduction. This novel weaves together a gripping narrative of love, historical exploitation, and the modern fight for immigrant justice. By intertwining personal stories with real names and events, it exposes the hypocrisy, profiteering, and systemic failures of America's immigration policies, past and present. Part 1, Love Across Borders. Chapter 1, Forbidden Love. Introduce Isabella, a U.S.-born activist, and Miguel, an undocumented worker from Mexico, whose love story begins in the shadows of a divided America. Highlight the challenges they face, from immigration status to societal prejudice. Chapter 2, A Legacy of Exploitation. Flashback to Isabella's grandparents, Maria and James, who struggled against exploitation during the Bracero program. Draw parallels to Miguel's current experience as a laborer for a farm owned by a politically connected family profiting from immigrant labor. Chapter 3, The Trump-era Backdrop. Introduce the political climate of the Trump administration, detailing its hardline immigration policies and personal hypocrisy, such as Melania Trump's work as an undocumented model before securing an Einstein visa. Discuss how Trump's policies, including the construction of the border wall, deepen divisions and disrupt families. Part 2, The Shadow of Profit. Chapter 4, For-Profit Detention. Miguel is arrested during an ICE raid and sent to a privately run detention center managed by CCC of America. Expose the role of for-profit detention centers in exploiting detainees for cheap labor, tying in real-life examples of such practices. Chapter 5, Political Hypocrisy. Introduce VP-elect J.D. Vance and his ties to immigrant labor exploitation, detailing how he and other politicians profit from industries reliant on undocumented workers. Highlight the silence of Democratic leaders who once called for amnesty but now support stricter border policies, reflecting business-driven shifts in the party. Chapter 6, Fighting for Love. Isabella works with advocacy groups, including American Families United, to navigate the legal maze of securing Miguel's release. Explore the systemic barriers faced by mixed-status families, emphasizing the emotional and financial toll. Part 3, History Repeats Itself. Chapter 7, Echoes of the Past. Delve into America's history of exploiting immigrant labor, from child labor in the early 20th century to the current use of immigrant workers in meatpacking and agriculture. Highlight the parallels between the Bracero program and today's guest worker programs. Chapter 8, DACA and Betrayal. Introduce secondary characters who are DACA recipients, showing their contributions to society and the uncertainty they face due to political inaction. Explore how bipartisan failures have left immigrant families in limbo, despite promises from Democratic leaders like President Biden. Chapter 9, Love as Resistance. Isabella uncovers her family's history of activism, finding inspiration in their resilience. Miguel leads a quiet resistance within the detention center, fostering solidarity among detainees and exposing abuses to outside allies. Part 4, Breaking the Silence. Chapter 10, Legal Battles and Public Outcry. Isabella teams up with legal experts to expose corruption in the detention industry, using Miguel's case as a rallying point. Reveal how the media's attention forces reluctant politicians to address the injustices within the immigration system. Chapter 11, Calling Out the Players. Explicitly name political figures, including Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Melania Trump, to showcase their hypocrisy and complicity in exploiting immigrant labor. Highlight the Democrats' failure to advocate for comprehensive immigration reform, contrasting it with their rhetoric during campaign seasons. Chapter 12, Small Victories. Miguel is released, but the larger fight for immigrant rights continues. Emphasize the importance of collective action and the resilience of love in overcoming systemic injustice. Conclusion. Chapter 13, A Bridge Forward. Reflect on the lessons learned from history and the ongoing fight for justice. Call for a unified effort to reform immigration policies and dismantle systems of exploitation. Epilogue. Lessons from the Shadows tie together the historical and modern struggles of immigrants in America, emphasizing their contributions and the injustices they endure. End with a hopeful message about the power of love, community, and resilience to effect change. Author's note: this novel is inspired by real events and people. It aims to shed light on the systemic failures of America's immigration system and the individuals who profit from its injustices. It is dedicated to the families who fight for justice and unity against all odds. Shadows of the Wall, Love, Labor, and the Fight for Justice in America. Prologue. The sun dipped low over the Texas horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty fields where generations had toiled. Maria stood at the edge of the vast cotton plantation, her hands rough from years of labor. It was 1943, and whispers of the war overseas mingled with the rustling of the crops. Yet another battle waged silently at home, a struggle for dignity and equality. Her husband, James, had left months ago to join the Bracero program, a government initiative promising fair wages and respectable work to Mexican laborers willing to fill the agricultural void left by American soldiers. Letters came sporadically, each one revealing more about the harsh realities of broken promises and exploitation. James wrote of grueling hours under the scorching sun, inadequate shelter, and meager pay that barely covered necessities. Maria clutched his latest letter, her heart heavy but resolute. Their love had weathered storms of prejudice and hardship, a beacon of hope in relentless times. She gazed toward the distant fields, envisioning a future where their children wouldn't have to fight the same battles. Decades later, their legacy would echo through their granddaughter, Isabella, who would find herself entangled in a modern struggle eerily reminiscent of the past. As new walls, both tangible and ideological, rose within America, the lines between history and the present blurred, setting the stage for a journey of love, betrayal, and unwavering resilience. Chapter 1. Forbidden Love. Isabella adjusted her scarf against the biting wind as she navigated the crowded streets of New York City. The city pulsed with life, a mosaic of faces from every corner of the globe. She loved this about New York, the sense of belonging it offered to everyone and no one all at once. She hurried into the law firm where she worked as a paralegal, a modest office tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore in the heart of Manhattan. The firm specialized in immigration law, and today's schedule was packed with clients seeking asylum, work permits, or fighting deportation orders. "You're cutting it close," her colleague Marcus teased as she slid into her desk. "Subway delays," Isabella replied with a smirk. "What's on the docket today?" "First up is a consultation with a new client, Ahmed Al-Masri," Marcus said, handing her a file. "Syrian national, here on an expired student visa." Isabella nodded, flipping through the pages. Ahmed's record showed a history of community service and no criminal background, another case of the system failing good people, she thought. A few minutes later, Marcus ushered Ahmed into the meeting room. Isabella looked up and was struck by the quiet confidence in his eyes, a deep brown that seemed to hold stories untold. "Thank you for seeing me," Ahmed said softly, his slight accent hinting at his Middle Eastern roots. "Please have a seat," Isabella replied warmly. "Tell me how we can assist you." As they delved into his situation, Isabella learned that Ahmed had come to the United States on a scholarship to study engineering. When conflict escalated back home, returning was no longer an option. His visa had lapsed, and he now faced the threat of deportation. "I've built a life here," Ahmed explained. "I volunteer at local shelters, and I'm part of a community that feels like family." Isabella felt a familiar frustration rise. Policies meant to regulate were instead tearing lives apart. "We'll do everything we can to help you stay," she assured him. Over the following weeks, their professional relationship deepened into friendship. Late nights spent preparing legal documents evolved into conversations about their favorite books, their dreams, and the challenges their families had faced. One evening, after finalizing paperwork, they stepped out into the crisp night air. "Sometimes I feel like I'm trapped between two worlds," Ahmed confessed. "Not fully belonging thither." Isabella glanced at him thoughtfully. "I understand more than you might think. My grandparents were migrant workers. Their stories were of hardship but also of hope." She hesitated before continuing. "They faced prejudice for their relationship. My grandmother Maria was Mexican-American, and my grandfather James was African-American. Back then, their love in the eyes of society." Ahmed looked at her with a newfound curiosity. "And now, here we are." "Yes," she smiled softly. "Here we are." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them faded. But the blare of a passing siren jolted them back to reality, a stark reminder of the uncertainties looming over them. As they parted ways, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than coincidence. The threads of her family's past were weaving into her present, guiding her toward a path she was only beginning to comprehend. Little did they know, forces beyond their control were already in motion. Political tides were shifting, and soon both their lives would be caught in the undertow of a nation's reckoning with its identity. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction inspired by real events and historical contexts. It aims to shed light on the personal struggles behind the headlines, emphasizing the human stories often overshadowed by political rhetoric. All characters are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons is coincidental. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Wall. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the office as Isabella sat at her desk, reviewing Ahmed's file for the third time that day. She couldn't shake the weight of his case, and not just because of its legal challenges. Ahmed's situation, like so many others, reflected a growing trend: families torn apart, lives upended, and futures gambled in a system designed to fail those most in need. A notification on her phone pulled her attention. The headline blared: President calls for expansion of border wall amid deportation surge. She sighed, scrolling through the article. The rhetoric was familiar: security, rule of law, and protecting American jobs. These words had become a weapon, wielded against the very people who built the foundation of the country. She thought of her grandparents. Maria and James had faced their own wall decades ago, not of bricks and steel but of prejudice and systemic barriers. Maria's letters to James during his time in the Bracero program had been preserved in a worn shoebox, now tucked away in Isabella's apartment. Those letters were a lifeline, a window into a time when love and resilience defied the odds. She decided to revisit them that evening, seeking clarity in the echoes of the past. By the time Isabella arrived home, the city was quiet, its frenetic energy replaced by the low hum of passing cars and distant sirens. She pulled the shoebox from her closet and settled onto the couch. The scent of aged paper filled the room as she unfolded the first letter. Dear James, the fields feel emptier without you. The days are long, but it's the nights that weigh the heaviest. I hear stories from other wives how the promises of fair wages are nothing but lies. How the work is harder than any of us imagined. I pray for your safety and strength every day. Yours always. Maria. Isabella traced the faded ink with her finger. Her grandmother's words resonated deeply, mirroring the desperation she saw in Ahmed's eyes when he spoke of his uncertainty. She opened another letter. James, the children ask about you every day. I tell them their father is brave, that he's working hard to give us a better life. But I can't ignore the whispers, stories of men working sunup to sundown for scraps, of accidents with no one to help. Feels like we're fighting a war no one sees. Stay strong, my love. Maria. Isabella leaned back, her chest tight with emotion. Her grandparents' struggle was a different chapter of the same book she was living now. Players had changed, but the story remained, a system profiting off the labor and sacrifices of those it refused to acknowledge. The next morning, Isabella's resolve hardened. She arrived at the office early, determined to push Ahmed's case forward. She spent hours researching precedents, drafting arguments, and preparing for the inevitable court battle. Midway through her work, Marcus leaned over her desk. Have you seen the latest? He asked, holding up his phone. Isabella read the headline: For-profit detention centers see record profits amid immigration crackdown. Below it was an image of a sprawling facility surrounded by barbed wire, its name stark against the desert backdrop: CCC of America Detention Facility. Ahmed's been there, Marcus said. The conditions are horrific. They make detainees work for pennies, claiming it's for their own upkeep. Isabella's stomach churned. They're profiting off human suffering. That's the business model, Marcus replied grimly. She stared at the photo, imagining Ahmed trapped within those walls. It was one thing to hear about these places in abstract terms. It was another to know someone who had experienced it firsthand. Her thoughts raced. Case wasn't just about Ahmed anymore, it was about exposing the injustices of a system built to exploit. She grabbed her phone and began dialing contacts, reaching out to journalists, advocacy groups, and anyone who might listen. "This isn't just a legal fight," she told Marcus. "It's a fight for dignity." That evening, Isabella met Ahmed at a community center where he volunteered. He was organizing donations for newly arrived immigrants, clothes, toiletries, and canned goods neatly arranged on folding tables. "You're early," he said, smiling as he spotted her. "I couldn't wait," she admitted. "There's something I want to talk about." He set down a box and gestured for her to continue. "I read about the CCC facility," she began. "I want to do more than just win your case. I want to shine a light on what's happening there, on the whole system." Ahmed's expression darkened. "I've seen it," he said quietly. "The overcrowded rooms, the lack of medical care, the endless hours of labor. They treat us like we're less than human. That's why we have to fight," Isabella said firmly. "Not just for you, but for everyone caught in this system." Ahmed studied her, his gaze filled with gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "Thank you," he said finally, "for believing in us." As they continued sorting donations, Isabella felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her grandparents had fought their battles. Now it was her turn. And she wasn't just fighting for Ahmed, she was fighting for every story that echoed through history, demanding justice in a world that had long ignored it. Little did they know, their fight was about to collide with forces far more powerful than they could have imagined. The walls weren't just physical, they were political, economic, and deeply entrenched. And tearing them down would take more than love, it would take a revolution. Chapter 3. The House of Prophets. The steady rhythm of Ahmed's breath echoed in the quiet room as he carefully folded the last of the donated clothes. He had perfected the art of finding peace in simple tasks, a skill he had relied on during his time in the CCC detention center. Yet, no matter how much he tried to focus on the present, memories of those walls loomed like specters in his mind. His hands stilled as he caught Isabella watching him. Her expression was a mix of determination and concern. "You okay?" she asked. Ahmed nodded, though he didn't trust his voice to carry the truth. He had learned long ago that resilience wasn't the absence of fear but the act of moving forward despite it. "Did you know," Isabella began, "that the CCC detention centers report billions in profits each year? Their CEO earns more than the President of the United States." Ahmed's lips tightened. "I know. We built their profits. Every meal I cooked, every floor I scrubbed, every box I packed for pennies, they profited from all of it." Isabella leaned forward, her voice low but fierce. "We can expose them, Ahmed. Not just in court but to the public. People need to see the truth." Ahmed's eyes met hers. "And what happens when they don't care? When they look away?" "We won't let them," she said. "But first I need more from you. Details, everything you saw and experienced." Ahmed hesitated. The memories were raw, his time in the center a scar he hadn't yet allowed himself to touch. But if his story could bring change, then it was worth the pain. "All right," he said finally. "I'll tell you everything." The next day, Isabella sat across from Ahmed in her office, a recorder between them. The blinds were drawn, and the hum of the city outside was muffled, creating a cocoon of trust and focus. "Started with the intake," Ahmed began. "They treat you like a criminal from the moment you walk in. Strip searches, dehumanizing questions, even mockery if you don't speak English well enough." Isabella nodded, jotting down notes. "Go on." "They cram us into cells, sometimes 20 of us in a space meant for 10. There's no privacy, no proper medical care. If you're sick, you're told to tough it out. If you're injured, you're ignored." "And the labor?" Isabella asked. Ahmed's jaw clenched. "It's endless. They call it voluntary, but if you refuse, they punish you. You lose privileges, phone calls, showers, even access to fresh air. We cleaned their offices, cooked their food, packed products for companies that contract with CCC. All for $1 a day, if that." Isabella's pen paused. "Companies like..." Ahmed shrugged. "Big names." brands you see in every store. But no one wants to talk about where the work gets done. Her mind raced, already formulating a plan. Exposing this would take more than a courtroom, it would require the court of public opinion. Ahmed, this is huge. If we can tie CCC to major corporations and show the public what's happening, you think they'll care? Ahmed interrupted, his tone sharp. These people built their wealth on our backs. They've been doing it for decades. Isabella met his gaze. Maybe not everyone will care, but enough will. Enough to force change. Ahmed leaned back, his expression unreadable. I hope you're right. That evening, Isabella began her research in earnest. She combed through corporate filings, public contracts, and whistleblower reports. Patterns emerged: contracts between CCC and multinational companies, campaign donations to politicians from both parties, and lobbying efforts to expand detention facilities. The deeper she dug, the more enraged she became. Politicians like J.D. Vance, now the vice president-elect, had openly decried undocumented immigrants while quietly profiting from industries reliant on their labor. Even figures like former President Trump, whose administration had championed the border wall, had ties to businesses employing undocumented workers. And then there was Melania Trump. Isabella smirked bitterly at the irony. A woman who had once worked as an undocumented model securing a visa reserved for exceptional individuals. Exceptional hypocrisy, Isabella muttered under her breath. She compiled her findings into a growing dossier, each piece of evidence another thread in a tapestry of exploitation. By the time she looked at the clock, it was past midnight, but she felt no fatigue, only resolve. The next morning, Isabella met with Marcus in a quiet corner of the office. I need your help, she said, sliding the dossier across the table. This isn't just about Ahmed's case anymore. It's about the whole system. Marcus flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. This is explosive, but it's also dangerous. I know, Isabella replied. But we have to do something. Marcus nodded slowly. What's the plan? We start small, Isabella said. Leverage Ahmed's story to draw attention. Then we go public with the rest. Press conferences, op-eds, maybe even a documentary. Whatever it takes to expose this. Marcus tapped the folder thoughtfully. You realize this could put a target on your back. These people have power, real power. I don't care, Isabella said firmly. If we don't fight for justice, who will? Marcus smiled faintly. You've got fire, I'll give you that. Let's do it. Later that day, Isabella shared the plan with Ahmed. As she outlined their strategy, she saw a spark of hope in his eyes, a spark that had been dimmed by years of fear and injustice. Are you ready for this? She asked. Ahmed nodded. I've been ready my whole life. Together, they stood on the precipice of a fight that would test their courage, their convictions, and their love. The walls they faced weren't just physical, they were systemic, entrenched, and fiercely defended. But for the first time, they weren't alone. The battle had begun. Chapter 4. Cracks in the wall. The courthouse was a fortress of pale stone, its columns soaring into the gray winter sky. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, whispers weaving between the rows of worn wooden benches. Isabella sat beside Ahmed, her hand brushing against his in silent reassurance. It wasn't Ahmed's first court appearance, but it was his most pivotal. Today's hearing would determine whether his deportation case would proceed to trial or be dismissed altogether. On the other side of the room sat the government attorney, armed with binders full of regulations and precedents, ready to argue that Ahmed's expired visa made him unfit to remain in the country. Isabella scanned the room, catching glimpses of others who were here for similar reasons. Mothers clutching children, fathers with weathered faces, young adults gripping folders of documents that represented their entire lives. The stakes were different for each of them, but the fear was the same. Isabella! Ahmed's voice brought her back to the moment. He leaned toward her, his expression calm but resolute. No matter what happens, thank you. For everything. She shook her head. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The clerk called Ahmed's name and they rose together. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, motioned for them to approach. Isabella adjusted her blazer, her heart pounding, and took her place at the counsel table. The arguments unfolded like a choreographed dance, each side presenting its steps with precision. The government attorney emphasized Ahmed's expired visa and painted him as another case in an overwhelmed system. Isabella countered with Ahmed's spotless record, his community involvement, and the dangers he would face if deported. But then Isabella took a calculated risk. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "this case is about more than just my client's visa. It's about a system that profits from detaining people like him, often under conditions that violate basic human rights." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting this case extends beyond the individual circumstances of your client?" "Yes, Your Honor," Isabella replied, her words gaining momentum. Ahmed was detained in a CCC of America facility, where detainees are forced to work for virtually no pay. These facilities profit from exploiting people who are already vulnerable, and Ahmed's case is a direct result of this broken system. The government attorney objected, but the judge silenced him with a wave of her hand. "Ms. Alvarez," the judge said, her tone measured, "your argument is unconventional. However, I will allow you to proceed." Isabella seized the opportunity. She described Ahmed's experiences in vivid detail, drawing on his testimony and the growing body of evidence she and Marcus had compiled. She painted a picture of systemic injustice, connecting Ahmed's story to the broader exploitation of immigrants across the country. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Ms. Alvarez, while this court cannot address the systemic issues you've raised, your argument does underscore the human cost of our policies. I will take this under advisement." She turned to Ahmed. "Mr. Al-Masri, your case will proceed to trial. In the meantime, you are granted supervised release." Relief washed over Isabella and Ahmed like a tidal wave. It wasn't the dismissal they had hoped for, but it was a chance, a lifeline. Inside the courthouse, the cold air felt sharper, fresher. Ahmed turned to Isabella, his gratitude unspoken but clear in his eyes. "You were incredible in there," he said. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "We've opened a door. Now we have to push it wide open." As they walked away, Ahmed's phone buzzed. A message from one of his friends at the community center read, "You're on the news." Ahmed showed Isabella the text, and they hurried to a nearby cafe. On the TV, a reporter stood outside the courthouse, summarizing the day's events. "The case has drawn attention due to allegations against CCC of America, a private company accused of exploiting detainees for profit. While the court has yet to address these claims, advocates argue that cases like Ahmed Al-Masri's highlight broader issues within the immigration system." Isabella's phone buzzed next, a call from Marcus. "You just kicked a hornet's nest," Marcus said, his tone half admiring, half anxious. "I've already had 3 reporters calling about Ahmed's case." "Good," Isabella replied. "The more people paying attention, the better." "Be careful, Isabella," Marcus warned. "This isn't just about Ahmed anymore. You're going up against powerful interests, and they don't play fair." "I know," she said. "But if we don't fight, who will?" That evening, Isabella returned to her apartment to find an envelope slipped under her door. She opened it cautiously, her heart sinking as she read the contents. "Drop the case, or else." The words were typed, cold, and anonymous, but the threat was clear. She clutched the note, her resolve hardening. They could threaten her, but they couldn't silence her. Ahmed's case wasn't just a fight for his freedom, it was a battle against a system that thrived on fear and silence. And Isabella wasn't about to back down. Cracks in the wall were beginning to show. It was time to break it apart. Chapter 5. The Price of Defiance. Isabella stared at the note in her trembling hands, its menace seeping into her bones. The bold, stark letters burned into her mind. "Drop the case, or else." She glanced at her locked door, her heart racing. The threat was real, and the stakes had just escalated. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was she putting Ahmed and herself in greater danger? Could she take on a system designed to crush anyone who challenged it? But then, the faces of those in the courtroom earlier that day flashed before her. The mothers holding their children close, the young men like Ahmed, desperate for a sliver of hope. This wasn't just about one case, it was about justice for all of them. Isabella snapped a photo of the note, saved it on her phone, and then called Marcus. "Marcus, someone's trying to intimidate me," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "I found a threatening note under my door." "What?" Marcus exclaimed. "Did you see anyone? Do you have cameras?" "No," she admitted. "But this isn't going to stop me." "Isabella, you need to report this," Marcus insisted. "If they're threatening you now, it could get worse." "I will," she replied, already dreading the call to the police. "But this means we're hitting a nerve. They're scared of what we'll expose." "They should be," Marcus said firmly. "But you need to stay safe. Let's meet tomorrow to go over the next steps." Isabella hung up and took a deep breath. She wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The next morning, Isabella filed a police report about the note. The officer on duty was polite but nonchalant, filing the report as if it were routine. "Do you have any suspects?" he asked. Isabella hesitated. "It's related to a high-profile immigration case I'm working on. People behind it. They're powerful." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "We'll look into it," he said, sliding the report into a folder. But Isabella doubted anything would come of it. She had learned long ago that the system rarely protected those fighting against it. At the office, Marcus greeted her with coffee and a grim expression. "I've been thinking about your case," he said. "If CCC of America is behind this, we need to assume they'll fight dirty." "They already are," Isabella said, setting her bag down. "But we have more than just Ahmed's testimony now. I found contracts linking CCC to major corporations. If we can prove those corporations knew about the labor practices in these facilities, we could blow this wide open." "Have you spoken to any journalists yet?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Isabella admitted. "But I think it's time." Marcus nodded. "I'll reach out to some trusted contacts. But you should keep digging. The more evidence we have, the harder it'll be for them to bury this." That afternoon, Isabella met Ahmed at the community center. He was organizing donations again, his calm demeanor masking the turmoil she knew he must feel. "Did you hear about the note?" she asked, her voice low. Ahmed nodded. "Marcus told me." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "But this just proves we're on the right track. We need to push harder." Ahmed hesitated, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I've been writing down names," he said. "People I met in the detention center, others who were forced to work. Some of them might be willing to talk." Isabella took the paper, her heart swelling with gratitude. This could change everything. Ahmed gave her a faint smile. "You've already changed everything. For me." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world outside the room seemed to fade. But reality rushed back in with the sound of the center's door opening. Another family had arrived, their faces weary from the weight of their journey. That evening, Isabella sat at her desk, reviewing the names Ahmed had provided. Each one was a potential ally, a piece of the puzzle that could expose the truth. But as she typed up her notes, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Isabella, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice electric. "One of my journalist friends is interested in Ahmed's case. They want to meet." "Who?" she asked, her excitement tempered by caution. "Alma Reyes from the Chronicle. She's been covering immigration issues for years. If anyone can help us, it's her." Isabella's pulse quickened. Alma Reyes was known for fearless reporting and unearthing the stories others were too afraid to tell. "When can we meet?" "Tomorrow morning," Marcus replied. "I'll set it up." The next day, Isabella and Marcus met Alma in a quiet cafe near her office. Alma was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, her no-nonsense demeanor softened by a warm smile. "Tell me everything," Alma said, pulling out a recorder. Isabella laid out the details of Ahmed's case, the labor practices in the CCC facilities, and the contracts linking them to major corporations. Marcus handed her copies of the evidence they had gathered. Alma listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is big," she said finally. "But it's also dangerous. If we publish this, we'll be going up against some of the most powerful players in the country." "That's why we need you," Isabella said. "You have the platform to make people pay attention." Alma nodded slowly. "All right. I'll start with Ahmed's story. It'll give us a human angle to hook readers. But if we're going to take this further, we need more. Names, documents, anything that proves systemic wrongdoing." "We're working on it," Marcus assured her. As they left the cafe, Isabella felt a flicker of hope. The truth was a weapon, and they were sharpening it. But she also knew the fight was far from over. People behind the walls of CCC wouldn't go down without a fight. And neither would she. Chapter 6. Breaking the silence. The article hit the newsstands early the next morning, splashed across the digital front pages of major media outlets. Alma Reyes's headline was simple yet striking. "Inside America's for-profit immigration machine, one man's fight against exploitation." Isabella sat in her kitchen, scrolling through the article on her phone while the sun rose outside her window. Alma had done a masterful job of weaving Ahmed's story into a broader exposé on CCC of America. Piece detailed the inhumane conditions, the forced labor, and the billions of dollars in profit funneled to executives and politicians. Quotes from Ahmed stood out, raw and honest. "We were treated like machines, not people. Every day felt like a punishment for simply existing." Alma hadn't held back in calling out the culprits. The article named corporations tied to CCC, detailing their lucrative contracts for cheap labor. It also didn't shy away from naming politicians who had received campaign donations from the detention industry. J.D. Vance's ties were front and center, as were Trump's connections to companies benefiting from CCC contracts. By noon, the article had gone viral. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like "and." Advocacy groups rallied behind the story, and calls for investigations into CCC of America began trending. Isabella's phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support and inquiries from other journalists. But not all the attention was positive. By midday, a black SUV was parked outside Isabella's building. She spotted it through her apartment window and immediately felt a chill. It hadn't been there before, and its dark-tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. She grabbed her phone and called Marcus. "There's a car outside my building. It's been there for hours. Do you think it's them?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. "I don't know," she said. "But I'm not taking any chances." "Stay inside," Marcus urged. "I'll come over." "No," Isabella replied firmly. "I'm not going to let them scare me. I have a meeting with Alma and Ahmed this afternoon, and I'm going." Marcus sighed. "Just be careful, Isabella. They're watching now." At the cafe, Alma was already waiting with Ahmed. The air was charged with urgency as Isabella joined them. "We're getting leads," Alma said, leaning in. "Whistleblowers from inside CCC facilities are reaching out. They're confirming everything Ahmed said and more." Ahmed looked uneasy. "More?" Alma nodded grimly. "There are reports of sexual harassment, denial of medical care, and retaliation against detainees who speak out. This goes deeper than forced labor." Ahmed's hands clenched into fists. "How is this allowed to happen?" "Because it's profitable," Isabella said, her voice steely. "And because too many people in power benefit from keeping it quiet." Alma spread out a stack of papers on the table. "I've also been digging into campaign finance records. CCC's donations aren't limited to one party. They've given to Democrats and Republicans alike, ensuring bipartisan silence." Isabella scanned the documents. Familiar names leaped out: senators, governors, even local officials in states with CCC facilities. "We need to push this further," Isabella said. "Expose every name, every connection. This isn't just about one company, it's about the entire system." Alma smiled. "That's the plan. But we need more concrete evidence. Ahmed, do you know anyone else who might be willing to come forward?" Ahmed hesitated. "There's one person," he said finally. "A guard. He hated what was happening but said he couldn't afford to lose his job. I think he might talk if he knew it could make a difference." "Can you reach him?" Isabella asked. Ahmed nodded. "I'll try." As they left the cafe, Ahmed's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Isabella asked. "It's my landlord," Ahmed said. "He's evicting me." "What?" Isabella exclaimed. "Why?" "He said he doesn't want trouble," Ahmed replied bitterly. "I guess my name in the news is too much for him." Isabella's stomach sank. The fallout was already starting. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "You can stay with me if you need to." Ahmed hesitated, but the relief in his eyes was undeniable. "Thank you." As they walked to Isabella's car, the black SUV she'd seen earlier pulled up alongside them. Passenger window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit with a cold, calculating expression. "Ms. Alvarez," the man said. "A word of advice: stop what you're doing. For your own good." Ahmed stepped forward, but Isabella placed a hand on his arm. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "Call it a suggestion," the man replied. "You're playing with fire. Don't get burned." The SUV sped off before Isabella could respond. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. "They're scared," Ahmed said quietly. "That's why they're trying to intimidate you." "Good," Isabella said, her voice firm. "Because I'm not stopping." That night, Isabella filed another police report, though she knew it was unlikely to deter whoever was behind the threats. She sat with Ahmed in her living room, reviewing the names of potential whistleblowers. "This isn't just a legal battle anymore," she said. "It's a war. And we're going to win." Ahmed looked at her, his expression a mix of admiration and determination. "Whatever it takes," he said. "I'm with you." As they worked late into the night, the shadows outside her window seemed to grow longer. But for the first time, Isabella didn't feel afraid. She felt ready to face whatever came next, because walls were built to be broken. Chapter 7: Allies and Enemies. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alma's article had sparked national outrage, drawing attention from advocacy groups, journalists, and even a few politicians who saw an opportunity to grandstand. Isabella, Marcus, and Ahmed found themselves inundated with calls from organizations offering support and whistleblowers willing to share their stories. But the backlash was equally fierce. Anonymous threats flooded Isabella's inbox. Social media buzzed with vitriol from trolls accusing Ahmed of being a criminal and Isabella of being unpatriotic. It was exhausting, but it only strengthened their resolve. Meeting the guard, Ahmed managed to contact the former CCC guard, a man named Hector Ramirez. They arranged to meet in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. Hector was in his late 30s, his face lined with weariness. He glanced around nervously as he slid into the booth across from Isabella and Ahmed. "I shouldn't be here," Hector said, his voice low. "If they find out I'm talking to you, they'll ruin me." "We'll protect your identity," Isabella assured him. "We just need the truth." Hector hesitated, then sighed. "The place is a hellhole," he began. "They pack people in like sardines. I've seen detainees collapse from dehydration because they weren't given enough water. And the labor? It's not voluntary, no matter what they say. If you refuse, they punish you: solitary confinement, no phone calls, even cutting off visits." Ahmed nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I experienced." Hector rubbed his temples. The worst part is the higher-ups know. They don't care. It's all about profit. They cut corners everywhere: medical care, food, security. They treat these people like they're disposable. Do you have proof? Isabella asked. Documents, emails, anything? Hector hesitated again. I kept copies of some memos before I left. They talk about maximizing profits, cutting costs, and using detainee labor to fill corporate orders. I'll give them to you. But if my name comes out, it won't, Isabella promised. You're doing the right thing, Hector. This could change everything. Pushing the story with Hector's memos in hand, Alma prepared a follow-up article. The new evidence painted a damning picture of CCC's operations, linking them to household name corporations and detailing the systematic exploitation of detainees. Alma's team also uncovered financial ties between CCC and prominent politicians, including recent donations to J.D. Vance's campaign and lobbying efforts aimed at expanding detention contracts. Isabella knew the article would make waves, but it also put a bigger target on their backs. Price of truth. 2 days after the article went live, Marcus stormed into Isabella's office, his face pale. We've been hacked, he said, dropping his laptop onto her desk. Emails, files, client records, they've stolen everything. Isabella's stomach churned. Do you know who did it? No, but it's not a coincidence, Marcus said. They're trying to discredit us, make us look incompetent. Ahmed entered the room just as Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from Alma. Check the news. She opened the link and her heart sank. A headline on a fringe news site screamed, Immigration lawyer and illegal alien fabricate scandal for fame and profit. The article was filled with lies, twisting facts to paint Isabella as a corrupt lawyer exploiting Ahmed's case for personal gain. It accused Ahmed of being a criminal and claimed Alma's reporting was biased and untrustworthy. They're trying to turn public opinion against us, Isabella said, her voice trembling with anger. Ahmed placed a hand on her shoulder. We knew this would happen. They're scared of the truth. Tipping point: the smear campaign backfired. While it rallied CCC's allies, it also drew more attention to Isabella's fight. National news outlets picked up the story and public support swelled. Protesters gathered outside CCC facilities, chanting for justice and holding signs that read "End detention profits" and "Human rights for all." Isabella's phone buzzed constantly with messages from supporters and offers of help. But it wasn't enough. She knew the only way to bring real change was through the courts, and that meant taking on CCC directly. Filing the lawsuit with Marcus's help, Isabella filed a class action lawsuit against CCC of America on behalf of Ahmed and other former detainees. The suit accused CCC of violating federal labor laws, human rights, and constitutional protections. The filing made headlines, thrusting Isabella into the national spotlight. But it also unleashed a torrent of new threats. Anonymous emails warned her to drop the case. Her car was vandalized. Even Ahmed received ominous messages. You sure about this? Marcus asked one night as they worked late at the office. We don't have a choice, Isabella said. If we let them scare us off, they win. A fateful meeting the night after the lawsuit was filed, Isabella and Ahmed were followed home from the community center. A black sedan trailed them for several blocks before pulling alongside their car. Ahmed tensed, ready to confront whoever was inside, but Isabella stopped him. Not here, she said. Let's get to a public place. They pulled into a crowded gas station and the sedan drove off. Isabella's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. This is your final warning. Ahmed clenched his fists. They won't stop, will they? No, Isabella said. But neither will we. The fight against CCC of America had become more than just a legal battle. It was a war for the soul of the nation, a fight against greed, corruption, and the dehumanization of the most vulnerable. And Isabella, Ahmed, and their growing network of allies were determined to win, no matter the cost. Chapter 8. The Court of Public Opinion. The lawsuit against CCC of America sent shockwaves through the media. National news outlets picked up the story, and social media was flooded with hashtags like "and." Protests erupted outside CCC facilities across the country, with crowds chanting slogans and waving signs demanding accountability. But the backlash was swift. Politicians tied to CCC rushed to distance themselves, issuing statements condemning mismanagement while avoiding acknowledgement of their complicity. Corporate sponsors scrambled to downplay their connections, some even suspending contracts with CCC to avoid public scrutiny. Isabella, Ahmed, and their team watched it all unfold from the law office. For every supportive headline, there was a counterattack. Op-eds accusing them of fabricating claims, anonymous sources questioning their integrity, and a steady stream of online harassment. "It's like fighting a hydra," Marcus muttered as he scrolled through a newsfeed. "Cut off one head and two more take its place." "Let them try," Isabella said firmly. "The truth is on our side." Escalating threats, the pressure wasn't just online. Isabella returned home one evening to find her apartment door ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, her phone ready to call the police. The place had been ransacked, papers scattered, drawers overturned, her laptop smashed on the floor. Ahmed arrived minutes later, his face pale when he saw the mess. "This is an escalation," he said. "They're trying to scare you." "It won't work," Isabella replied, though her voice wavered. They called the police, but the response was perfunctory, a brief report and little assurance of action. Isabella could feel the weight of the threats closing in, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. "Whoever did this wants to silence me," she said. "That only means we're getting closer to the truth." Turning the tables the next morning, Alvarez published another explosive article, this time focusing on the corporations that had profited from CCC's labor practices. She named names, citing contracts, memos, and emails that exposed their complicity. The backlash was immediate. Stock prices for several major companies plummeted as public outrage grew. Advocacy groups launched boycotts, and shareholders demanded answers. Alma's reporting not only amplified the lawsuit but also turned the spotlight on the broader system of exploitation. As Isabella read the article, her phone buzzed with a text from Alma. "This is a fight for all of us. Keep going." Ahmed's voice, meanwhile, Ahmed was becoming a reluctant symbol of the movement. His story resonated with people across the country, and media outlets clamored for interviews. First, he resisted, wary of becoming a target. But Isabella encouraged him to speak out. "Your voice is powerful," she said. "You can make people see what's really happening." Ahmed finally agreed, appearing on a nationally televised interview. Dressed simply, his hands clasped nervously, he shared his experience with quiet determination. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm here because I believe in justice. No one should be treated the way we were treated, not in America, not anywhere." The response was overwhelming. Ahmed's story humanized the fight, turning abstract statistics into a visceral narrative. Donations poured into advocacy groups, and petitions demanding government investigations into CCC gained millions of signatures. A political shift, the pressure reached Capitol Hill. A handful of progressive lawmakers introduced legislation to ban for-profit detention centers and enforce stricter oversight of immigration facilities. The bill faced stiff opposition from both parties, but it marked a turning point in the national conversation. J.D. Vance, now vice president-elect, found himself under fire. Alma's reporting had tied him to CCC donations, and his public silence on the issue only fueled criticism. When pressed by reporters, he issued a carefully worded statement denying knowledge of CCC's practices but stopped short of condemning them. "Typical," Marcus said, rolling his eyes as they watched the news. "He's too deep in their pockets to take a stand." "We'll make it impossible for him not to," Isabella replied. Power of protests outside CCC facilities continued to grow. At one rally, Isabella and Ahmed joined a diverse crowd of activists, former detainees, and allies. Isabella spoke to the crowd, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't just about one company," she said. "It's about a system that dehumanizes and exploits for profit. It's about standing up for the dignity and rights of every person. And it's about making sure this never happens again. Crowd erupted in applause, their energy palpable. Ahmed stood beside her, his presence a silent testament to resilience. The next move back at the office, Isabella and Marcus strategized their next steps. The lawsuit was moving forward, but they knew CCC's legal team would fight tooth and nail to dismiss it. "We need more plaintiffs," Marcus said. "The stronger our case, the harder it'll be for them to shut us down." "I've been reaching out to other former detainees," Ahmed said. "Some are scared, but a few are willing to join." "That's good," Isabella said. "We'll need all the support we can get." As they worked late into the night, a sense of determination filled the room. They were taking on a giant, but they weren't alone. Cracks in the wall were growing, and it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. But as they prepared for the battles ahead, they couldn't ignore the shadows lurking at the edges, powerful forces that wouldn't go down without a fight. The real test was yet to come. Chapter 9. Into the fire. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as the opening arguments in the class action lawsuit against CCC of America began. Isabella sat beside Ahmed and the other plaintiffs, a mix of former detainees and families whose lives had been shattered by the detention system. Across the room, CCC's legal team exuded confidence, their suits crisp and their demeanor cold. "This is the moment we've been fighting for," Isabella whispered to Ahmed. He nodded, his jaw set with determination. Walls of Silence, Love, Labor, and this December 4, 2024, the lead attorney for CCC began with a predictable strategy: deny, deflect, and diminish. He painted the plaintiffs as opportunists, suggested that detainee labor was a voluntary program, and argued that CCC had always operated within the bounds of the law. When it was Isabella's turn, she stood and faced the judge, her voice steady and resolute. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about contracts and policies. It's about people who were stripped of their dignity, exploited for profit, and left to suffer in a system that prioritized money over humanity. We will prove that CCC not only violated labor laws but also basic human rights." The judge nodded, motioning for her to continue. Isabella presented evidence meticulously, weaving together testimonies, documents from Hector Ramirez, and damning contracts linking CCC to corporate beneficiaries. Behind the curtain outside the courtroom, Alma Reyes continued her relentless investigation. Her latest article uncovered even deeper ties between CCC and political power brokers. Emails leaked from a whistleblower within the company revealed conversations between CCC executives and influential lobbyists, strategizing ways to expand detention quotas under the guise of national security. Alma's reporting turned up the heat on J.D. Vance. Calls for his resignation as vice president-elect grew louder, fueled by his campaign donations from CCC and his refusal to denounce the company's practices. The administration attempted damage control, but the cracks in their facade were showing. The smear campaign. As the case gained momentum, CCC's allies intensified their attacks on Isabella and Ahmed. News outlets sympathetic to the company ran hit pieces questioning Isabella's motives and portraying Ahmed as a criminal. Social media was flooded with doctored photos and conspiracy theories, claiming the lawsuit was part of a radical agenda to undermine national security. One morning, Isabella awoke to find her face plastered across a tabloid with the headline, "Lawyer of Lies, the woman behind the anti-American agenda." She tossed the paper aside, her frustration boiling over. "They're desperate," Marcus said when she vented to him. "It means we're winning. 27, but at what cost?" Isabella muttered, rubbing her temples. A dark turn. The threats escalated. One night, Ahmed returned to Isabella's apartment to find a package at the door. Inside was a broken pair of handcuffs and a note, "You'll wish you stayed silent." "Enough is enough," Ahmed said, his voice trembling with anger. "We need protection." Isabella reported the incident to the police again, but the response was the same, a filed report and no real action. She decided to take matters into her own hands, installing cameras around her apartment and hiring a private security firm to monitor their movements. "We can't let them scare us," Isabella said, though her resolve was beginning to feel like a thin veneer over her growing fear. A turning point in the courtroom, the tide began to shift. Hector Ramirez took the stand, his testimony a bombshell. He described the abuses he witnessed at CCC facilities, from forced labor to retaliation against detainees who refused to comply. His words were backed by the memos he had provided, which detailed the company's calculated exploitation of detainees to maximize profits. Courtroom was silent as Hector concluded, his voice shaking but resolute. "I stayed silent for too long," he said. "But not anymore. People deserve to know the truth." Side reporters swarmed Hector, his testimony becoming the focal point of the day's news cycle. Advocacy groups hailed him as a hero, while CCC scrambled to discredit him, calling him a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Cost of truth: the closer the case came to a resolution, the more intense the pressure became. Isabella's team uncovered a critical piece of evidence. A CCC executive had sent an internal email explicitly directing facilities to push detainees into unpaid labor to meet corporate demands. "This is it," Marcus said, holding the email in his hands. "This is the smoking gun." Isabella felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by exhaustion. Every victory felt like a step deeper into a battle that seemed endless. The final blow: as the trial neared its conclusion, Isabella prepared her closing arguments. She stood before the courtroom, her voice steady but impassioned. "Your Honor, this case is not just about Ahmed or the other plaintiffs. It's about a system that has profited from suffering for far too long. CCC of America represents everything that is broken in our immigration system: greed, exploitation, and indifference to human life. This court has the power to send a message that no one is above accountability." The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Isabella finished, she returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Waiting for justice, the judge announced that she would issue her ruling in a week. Courtroom emptied, leaving Isabella, Ahmed, and their team to face the long wait ahead. Side protesters cheered them on, their chants echoing through the streets. As Isabella and Ahmed walked back to the car, he turned to her. "Do you think we did enough?" She nodded. "We did everything we could. Now we wait." But as they drove away, a sense of unease settled over Isabella. The fight wasn't over, not yet. And she knew that whatever the ruling, the forces behind CCC wouldn't give up without a final, desperate move. They had come too far to back down. And they would see this battle through to the end. Chapter 10. The verdict. The courthouse was quiet, its corridors echoing with the faint murmur of anticipation. Isabella sat with Ahmed and the other plaintiffs, their tension palpable. The judge's chambers loomed ahead, and with it, the decision that would 29 walls of silence, love, labor, and the December 4, 2024 determine the trajectory of their fight. Isabella glanced at Ahmed. He was calm, his hands clasped in his lap, but she could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She gave him a reassuring nod, though her own stomach was tied in knots. The doors opened, and the courtroom filled with spectators, reporters, and supporters. Isabella adjusted her blazer and steadied her breathing. This was the moment they had worked so tirelessly for. The judge entered, her expression unreadable. Everyone rose, then sat as she began to speak. Delivering the ruling. "This case has raised significant issues regarding the operation of for-profit detention centers," the judge began, her tone measured. "The evidence presented by the plaintiffs has been compelling, highlighting practices that challenge the ethical and legal boundaries of such institutions." Isabella's heart pounded as the judge continued. "After careful consideration, I find that CCC of America violated multiple federal labor laws by compelling detainees to perform unpaid labor under duress. Furthermore, their actions constitute a breach of basic human rights as recognized under our Constitution." A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Ahmed exhaled audibly, and Isabella felt her chest tighten with emotion. "However," the judge added, her tone sharpening, "this court does not have the authority to dismantle the broader system that allowed these abuses to occur. That responsibility lies with policymakers and the public." The judge turned to CCC's legal team. The defendants are ordered to compensate the plaintiffs for their labor and to implement immediate reforms to ensure compliance with labor laws. This court also recommends further investigation into the practices of CCC of America. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into a mix of cheers and chatter. Isabella turned to Ahmed, who gripped her hand tightly. "We did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We did it," Ahmed echoed, his eyes glistening with tears. The fallout outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters greeted them with applause and chants. Porters swarmed Isabella and Ahmed, their questions coming rapid fire. "How do you feel about the verdict? What's next for the plaintiffs? Do you believe this ruling will lead to broader reform?" Isabella raised her hand to quiet them. "Today's ruling is a victory, but it's just the beginning. Court has spoken, but the fight for justice continues. This case has exposed a system that prioritizes profit over people. We will keep fighting until that system is dismantled." Alma Reyes appeared beside them, her notepad in hand. "This is historic," she said. "But you're right, it's far from over." CCC's retaliation, the victory came with immediate consequences. CCC of America released a statement calling the verdict misguided and vowing to appeal. Their PR machine went into overdrive, spinning the ruling as an attack on national security and a threat to immigration enforcement. Within hours, conservative news outlets amplified CCC's narrative, accusing Isabella and Ahmed of jeopardizing border safety. Trolls on social media called for Isabella's disbarment and Ahmed's deportation. "Let them talk," Isabella said to Marcus. "Every lie they tell only brings more attention to the truth." Personal cost, but the threats were no longer just words. One evening, Isabella returned home to find her car vandalized, the windows smashed and the word "traitor" spray-painted across the hood. Private security teams she had hired began accompanying her everywhere, but the constant surveillance weighed heavily on her. "This is bigger than us now," Ahmed said one night as they sat in her apartment reviewing the next steps. "You've done enough, Isabella. Maybe it's time to step back." She shook her head. "We've come too far. If we stop now, they win." Ahmed nodded, his respect for her unwavering, but his concern etched deeply in his face. The national stage, the verdict reignited calls for legislative reform. Lawmakers introduced a bill to ban for-profit detention centers and enforce strict oversight of immigration facilities. The hearings became a spectacle, with CCC executives called to testify under oath. J.D. Vance found himself cornered. Alma's reporting, combined with the court ruling, made it impossible for him to remain silent. In a televised statement, he reluctantly acknowledged the need for reform but stopped short of addressing his own ties to CCC. "It's not enough," Marcus said as they watched the statement. "He's still trying to save face." "He'll have to answer eventually," Isabella replied. "We'll make sure of it." Ahmed's hope for Ahmed, the ruling brought more than justice, it brought opportunity. With CCC ordered to compensate the plaintiffs, he finally had the financial means to rebuild his life. But more importantly, the case had given him a platform to advocate for others. At a rally in Washington, D.C., he stood before a crowd of thousands and spoke with quiet conviction. "This fight is about more than just me or the people in that courtroom," he said. "It's about every person who has been treated as less than human. It's about holding those in power accountable and building a system that values dignity over dollars." Crowd erupted in applause, and Isabella watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. The next chapter, as the dust settled from the trial, Isabella and Ahmed found themselves at a crossroads. The fight against CCC had consumed their lives, but it had also forged a bond that was unbreakable. "What now?" Ahmed asked one evening as they walked through a quiet park. "We keep going," Isabella said. "There's still so much to do." "And us?" he asked, his voice softer. She smiled, her hand brushing against his. "Us? We're just getting started." The future was uncertain, but they faced it together, ready to break down every wall that stood in their way. Chapter 11. The Empire Strikes Back. The verdict may have been a victory, but CCC of America was far from defeated. Company's appeal process began almost immediately, with a high-powered legal team filing motions to delay compensation payments and overturn the ruling. Their public relations machine churned out stories painting the company as a victim of overreach by activist courts and claiming their practices were misunderstood. "Typical," Marcus muttered as he scrolled through the latest headlines. "They're trying to buy time." "They're not just stalling," Isabella said, pacing her office. "They're regrouping. They want to see if public interest fades, and if it does, they'll try to bury us in legal fees." Ahmed, seated at the conference table, frowned. "We can't let that happen. If they win the appeal, everything we fought for will be undone." "We won't let that happen," Isabella said, her tone firm. "But we need to be ready for a long fight." New allies. Walls of silence. Love, labor, and the December 4, 2024. The public outcry over CCC's practices had drawn the attention of powerful allies. A coalition of civil rights organizations, labor unions, and immigrant advocacy groups joined forces to launch a nationwide campaign against for-profit detention centers. They called for boycotts of companies tied to CCC, organized protests in major cities, and pressured lawmakers to act. One of the most surprising allies came from within Congress. A freshman representative from Texas, a former public defender named Sofia Martinez, reached out to Isabella with a proposal. "I'm introducing legislation to ban for-profit detention centers," Martinez said during a video call. "I want your help shaping the bill." Isabella hesitated. "I'm honored, but you know the political climate. This won't be an easy fight." "Nothing worth fighting forever is," Martinez replied. "But we have momentum on our side. If we don't act now, we may never get another chance." Isabella agreed, and the two began working closely to craft a bill that addressed the systemic issues highlighted by the CCC case. Ahmed also became involved, lending his voice and experiences to the effort. Retaliation. As their movement gained traction, CCC and its allies escalated their tactics. Isabella's private security team intercepted threatening packages sent to her office, including one containing a crude, homemade incendiary device. The FBI was called in, but the investigation yielded no suspects. Meanwhile, CCC-backed lobbyists worked behind the scenes to undermine the legislation. Leaked emails revealed their efforts to sway moderate lawmakers with promises of campaign donations and veiled threats of withdrawing corporate support from key industries. "They're playing dirty," Marcus said, slamming a printout of one of the leaked emails onto Isabella's desk. "They always have," Isabella replied. "But this time they're exposed. We have to keep the pressure on." The human cost. Walls of silence. Love, labor, and the December 4, 2024. While Isabella and her team fought in the courts and on Capitol Hill, Ahmed returned to the community center where his journey had begun. He met with other former detainees, helping them navigate the legal system and connecting them with resources to rebuild their lives. One evening, Ahmed sat with a young mother named Carla, who had been detained with her 2 children. "They still wake up screaming," Carla said, her voice trembling. "They're afraid someone's going to take them away again." Ahmed placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. "And we're going to make sure no one else has to go through this." His work at the center reminded him of why the fight mattered, even as the threats and challenges mounted. It wasn't just about policies or court rulings, it was about people like Carla and her children, who deserved a chance at a life free from fear. A national debate. As the proposed legislation gained media attention, the country became embroiled in a fierce debate. Supporters of the bill argued that for-profit detention centers were inherently exploitative and incompatible with basic human rights. Opponents claimed the bill would weaken immigration enforcement and jeopardize national security. Isabella and Ahmed appeared on a nationally televised town hall to discuss the issue. Facing a skeptical audience, they held their ground, using facts and personal stories to dismantle the arguments against the bill. "You call it enforcement," Ahmed said, his voice steady but impassioned. "But what you're enforcing is a system that profits from suffering. It's not about safety, it's about money. The audience erupted into applause, and the moment went viral, galvanizing support for their cause. The final push as the vote on the bill approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. CCC poured millions into lobbying efforts, flooding the airwaves with ads warning of chaos if the bill passed. But their tactics only seemed to strengthen the resolve of the movement. 35 on the day of the vote, thousands of protesters gathered outside the Capitol, chanting and holding signs. Isabella, Ahmed, and Representative Martinez stood among them, their presence a symbol of the fight for justice. Inside the chamber, the debate was heated, with lawmakers on both sides making impassioned speeches. When the final vote was announced, the bill passed by a narrow margin. Crowd outside erupted into cheers. Isabella and Ahmed embraced, tears streaming down their faces. It was a moment of triumph, but they knew the journey wasn't over. A new beginning with the bill signed into law, the era of for-profit detention centers began to draw to a close. CCC of America faced an uncertain future, its reputation and finances in tatters. But for Isabella and Ahmed, the victory was bittersweet. "This isn't the end," Isabella said as they walked through the now familiar halls of Congress. "There are still so many walls to tear down." "And we'll tear them down," Ahmed replied. One by one. Together, they stepped into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. Their fight had shown the power of resilience, love, and the unwavering belief that justice could prevail. And though the battle was far from over, they knew they had already changed the world. Chapter 12. After the walls fall, the air in Washington, D.C. was electric with the buzz of transformation. Passage of the anti-detention legislation marked the start of a new chapter in the fight for immigrant justice. Across the country, detention centers were shutting down, their operations forced to comply with new laws that banned the use of unpaid labor and imposed strict oversight. For Isabella and Ahmed, the victory felt surreal. They had spent months locked in battle, facing threats, defamation, and near-constant tension. Now there was a moment of quiet, a chance to reflect on what had been accomplished and what lay ahead. Rebuilding lives, Ahmed returned to the community center with renewed purpose. Former detainees and their families arrived daily, seeking guidance and support. Compensation ordered by the court was beginning to trickle in, and with it came opportunities for people to rebuild. Carla, the young mother Ahmed had befriended, now ran a support group for families recovering from the trauma of detention. "You inspired me," she told Ahmed one afternoon. "You showed us that we're not powerless." Ahmed smiled, his humility evident. "We inspired each other." Community Center became a hub for hope, its walls filled with laughter, plans for the future, and the resilience of people determined to reclaim their lives. A national reckoning, the ripple effects of the legislation reached far and wide. CCC of America faced a series of investigations into its practices, with executives resigning amid public outrage. Companies' appeal against the class action lawsuit was dismissed, cementing the legal victory for Ahmed and the other plaintiffs. But the fight wasn't just about one company. Isabella worked with lawmakers, advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations to push for broader reforms. Coalition that had formed during the battle against CCC now focused on issues like comprehensive immigration reform, pathways to citizenship, and protections for undocumented workers. "This is just the beginning," Representative Sofia Martinez said during a meeting with Isabella and other advocates. "We've shown that change is possible, but the work is far from over." Isabella nodded. "We've dismantled part of the system. Now we have to build something better." Cost of justice. Despite the progress, the scars of the fight lingered. Isabella's apartment still bore the marks of vandalism, a constant reminder of the risks she had taken. Her relationships with friends and family had been strained by the intensity of the battle, and she often wondered if she had pushed too hard. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city, Ahmed joined her. He handed her a cup of tea and sat quietly by her side. 37 Walls of Silence, Love, Labor, and the S. December 4, 2024. "Do you ever think about what we gave up?" she asked softly. "All the time," Ahmed replied. "But then I think about what we gained." Isabella turned to him, her expression searching. Was it worth it? Ahmed met her gaze, his voice steady. It was worth everything. A love that lasted over time, the bond between Isabella and Ahmed deepened. Their shared experiences had forged an unbreakable connection, one built on trust, respect, and a mutual determination to fight for justice. They celebrated small victories together, a new grant for the community center, a family reunited, a child smiling again after years of fear. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Ahmed struggled with the lingering trauma of his detention, while Isabella navigated the pressures of being a public figure in the legal world. But through it all, they found strength in each other. "We're not just surviving," Ahmed said one evening as they danced in the dim light of her living room. "We're living." A legacy of change months turned into years, and the world continued to change. New leaders emerged, inspired by the movement Isabella and Ahmed had helped ignite. Laws were passed that prioritized humanity over profit, and communities once divided by fear began to heal. Isabella continued her work as a lawyer, taking on cases that challenged systemic injustices. Ahmed expanded his efforts at the community center, creating programs to empower immigrants and refugees. One day, as they walked hand in hand through a park, Ahmed paused and looked at Isabella. "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked. Isabella smiled. "Enough to start something that will outlast us." Ahmed nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then let's keep going." Vlog. Breaking every wall in the years that followed, the story of Isabella and Ahmed became a symbol of resilience and hope. Their fight against CCC of America was taught in law schools and discussed in political science classes. Documentaries chronicled their journey, and communities across the country celebrated the changes they had helped bring about. But for Isabella and Ahmed, the true measure of their success was found in the lives they touched. The families reunited, the children who grew up without fear, and the walls that no longer stood to divide people. Their fight had been hard, their sacrifices great, but they had proven that love, justice, and courage could overcome even the most formidable barriers. And as they looked toward the future, they knew their story was far from over. 'Cause every wall that falls paves the way for something greater, a world built on hope, dignity, and the belief that justice belongs to everyone. By Elias Harper, 2024.